Yeah, super cool to speak, Paul. Thanks for doing this.
No problem, mate.
How long's the book been out now?
Jeez, I knew you were going to ask that. It's been about 6 weeks, I think, 6 to 8 weeks.
Have you been pleased with the reaction?
Yeah, I mean, I think we always knew that it was Elliott is a niche artist over here, so you weren't expecting blockbuster sales, but people have been, the response has been good, and I think people who've read it have enjoyed it. Had some really interesting responses from people who've been through mental health issues, who've found something in which is gratifying, and a couple of notes from people who knew him well, who've enjoyed it and or felt it was representative. So yeah, as pleased as I can be, I think.
So my missus, my wife, who was going to join us today, but she manages Emily Sandé, and Emily Sandé's got a record out in a couple of weeks, so she is otherwise detained. But she has been filling my head with things that she wanted me to ask you, so I'm going to try and weave a bit of that in.
Okay,
She's the Elliott Smith obsessive. She devoured that book like
that's lovely.
way quicker than it took me to read it. She just absolutely. I mean, it was like 48 hours, and in those 48 hours, she was consumed with darkness. She was like, "This is one of the saddest things I've ever read." Like
Yeah.
it was so upsetting to her, and I wondered what that was like writing it. I wondered if some of that sadness of writing about someone who was so, I don't know, almost so. In lots of ways, I think my reading of it was that he was almost not cut out for life. That's a sad thing to say, but that was my impression. Did you take that kind of emotional weight on when you were writing it?
It's a great question. Yeah. I mean, I found it. I worked on the book for about 18 months, obviously you'll know on all sorts of levels. And it was. I mean, it was a really difficult book to write from that point of view because it was just fine. The more you found out about him, the more, I mean, I was a fan anyway, but the more you grew to love and respect him as an artist, but the more profound the things he struggled with became, and the more obvious and evident how hard, the degree to which he did struggle and battle against those things. And there were people I spoke to. There'd been a couple of books before, and I think quite a few of the people who knew him and worked with him and were friends with him had felt a little bit burnt by the way they'd been presented in those things. So it took a degree of persuading and gentle coercion, for want of a better word, to get people to talk to me. And there was a couple of people in particular who were intimate friends with him, and interviewing them at length and on more than one occasion was deeply moving. And yeah, had a really profound effect. I did. It was a book that didn't leave you for the 18 months you were writing it. I think that's the easiest way of expressing it. The weight of that was with you the whole time.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of horror movies, and me and my
Yeah.
friends always joke that we have cool run-ins on standby when we've watched. So I sort of wondered what your decompression was after it. If you'd, I don't know if you'd eat, if you sort of decided to increase your vitamin C uptake or something. Like it just feels like that. I mean, one of the things I love about your writing is it's so precise. Like it's not fussy. Like it's just you're really good at like telling people's stories because you allow those stories to blossom as opposed to kind of inserting yourself into it. I think
Thank
I,
you.
I think that's such a great skill. Why Elliot though? I mean, it is a bit of a crowded, to be a bit gross. It is a bit of a crowded market. There are lots of people who've written about Elliot. Why did you think there was space for your telling of that story?
It wasn't my. I mean, being honest, it wasn't my idea initially. It was a publisher who approached me and said, "Would you be interested in doing this?" Um, and the initial reaction was, "There's been two books. What more can you bring?" So I read the books and did feel they were interesting, but there felt like there was a whole untold story there and a whole level of it. It felt slightly surface in the sense that it was the usual, troubled rock star, and then the whole conspiracy at the end of it. So I just felt there were a whole load of gaps that could be filled in. I also felt that I, you look at someone like Jeff Buckley, who you feel's been sort of canonized over the years and is held in this sort of place. It didn't feel that Elliott had his due as an artist and as a performer, as a musician, and the felt that there was something to be done there. And I guess ultimately, the ultimate thing was the more I looked into it and researched into it, you felt that, like we said at the start, that it wasn't something that was going to be landing on bestseller lists and for all sorts of reasons, but that there was, without wishing to sound pompous, that there was something worthy to be done with it, from the sense of doing, in a sense that it was about that there was a mental health story to tell, but try not to do it in a one-dimensional way, to try and do it in a way of an understand, and for my own benefit as well, gain an understanding of how you go from point A to point B, what there is in between all those points that affect someone, and if it helps, if it's possible to help anybody else by doing that, then great. But it was a bigger story than just Rockstar dies young. A much, much bigger story.
I think one of the things that's tough about writing, I mean, not that there's really been anyone like Elliott, but one of the things that's tough about writing about quote unquote troubled rock stars is A, to not romanticize it, which I don't think you do at all, but also to not kind of obscure the musicality of someone who deserves having a book written about them. Was it difficult to balance how much you wanted to talk about the mental health problems and how much you wanted to talk about him as, no hyperbole intended, a genius songwriter?
Yes and no, if that makes sense. And it's because you're always conscious of not wanting to trudge down one path or the other. I think the publisher Pete Selby was a big help in that respect. I think when you write, you write a book, there's always other people's input is invaluable, and editors and all those sorts of things. He did feel the first draft, and there wasn't really much done on it on the second draft. But he felt I've been a bit too kind on Elliott as a human being, because he said, he has behaved abominably at times, and maybe you need, and so that there was a little bit that you may be trying to be too far one way. But no, because I think that word, it's genius is a much overused, but it does. I genuinely think it does apply to him. He genuinely was a genius. You listen to those records. That was the joy of the book. Going back and listening to those records over and over again, and probably coming out the other side being even more awed by what he did than you are going in. So I think from the start, it was in my own mind, it was to try and strike a balance between the two things and not to lean too far one way or the other. So no, in that sense, but yes, there are times when particularly towards the last 3 years of his life, when it is very, very difficult to keep the music in perspective when you're dealing with someone who's hurtling into the darkest abyss possible. So
I think in my NME days, I used to write quite a lot about Richie Edwards. I was a huge fan as a teenager of that era of the Manics, and I hadn't really, I've had a lot of problems with the mental illness, and I wasn't so well versed in it at that point, and I think that I was trying to. I probably fell into the trap of slightly romanticising it, but I also think I was trying to solve it in a way. I was almost like, if I write so much about it, what is there a point where I can go, oh well, you know what? If this had happened, then maybe he would still be around today. And I definitely didn't get to that place. I'm not a mental health professional. I'm not a time traveller. But was there when you were writing it, did you think, to spend that much time in his story, was there a point where you thought, oh, there was probably a way he could still be here?
Good question. No, I think that I spoke to a couple of really, really bright, intelligent, astute mental health professionals. And there's the book wouldn't be, whatever the book is, it wouldn't be what it is without their input and what I was able to glean and take from them. And I think there was a sense from what you get from both of those, that there was a study done, and I think, how you do when you research things intensely, and then a lot of it just goes out. There was a study done that in I think it was early 2000s about people that suffer abuse at a young age, and the various terms of, and how the likelihood that that will be reflected in later life in issues of mental health and self-harm and suicidal thoughts, etc. And Elliott was on so many of those metrics that he would struggle, and he would battle, and he would have to fight. I think it comes back. I think that phrase you used, and you don't. That maybe he just wasn't cut out for it. Maybe it was all. He was born. He was weighted down by so many things. He was just unable to get himself out of that. And I think there were a lot of people around him who tried and showed willing. There was at the time undoubtedly less known about mental health and how to help with certain issues. But I think in any capacity, he would have found it difficult to try and get around it. I think it came back to there's a bit in the book, or there was the girl called Dorian Gary, woman called Dorian Gary, who I spoke to, who was Elliott's press officer, flatmate, friend, and confidant. And she said at the end that really all he looked for his whole life was a validation that what he thought had happened and what he believed had happened was accepted by people who loved him and were close to him, and he never got it. And that was critical and terminal for him.
Jesus. I've always been. It's maybe a side of my nature that I don't like so much, but I've always been interested in conspiracy. Obviously, you end up there.
Yeah.
I don't really know what to ask about that, really. Well, just in terms of the actual writing craft, how it's a really tough one to approach that, because you don't want to slander anyone, you don't want to almost kind of dilute your credibility as a journalist in wild speculations, and I do think you handle it really well. But how did you approach that? Was that something you were apprehensive about writing about?
Yeah, deeply apprehensive, because I think, however well-intentioned publishers and all the rest of it, the notion that you're going to uncover something that no one ever else has gives the book greater weight, I suppose, commercially, or whatever you want to talk about. But yeah, because I think there's an expectation from people reading it that you're going to tell them something they don't know in lots of ways, and that's the biggest don't know in the Elliott story. And all I tried to do in going through it was that, what did the people who know him and were closest enough to him glean, believe, know, and then what's the weight of the stuff that you're able to research and all the rest of it. And the further he went through it, it's an interesting, because Elliott, obviously, he lived in different places. So there's the Duncanville, then there's Portland, then there's Brooklyn, then there's LA, where he pitches up and settles. And he tended to move and shed people as he went to each, and have a new community around him in each place. And the people in Portland have a very, very different view generally than the people in LA do about what might have happened. And the only thing I can say is everything that I found out and the weight of everything that I read led me to believe that he did take his own life. And there were a few people I spoke to. One person in particular said, if you read, I was 20. Aaron Embry, a musician, and he said, I was in my 20s at the time, knew Elliott well during that period of his life, didn't really know how to handle it. And he said, but if you read and look at the lyrics to the music that became From a Basement on the Hill, in retrospect, he was telling us, he told us all the way through what he was going to do and what was going to happen. And the thing, like I mentioned earlier, that you gleaned from mental health professionals, Dr. Rachel Gillibrand was one of the people I spoke to, and she said something that was really illuminating, because a lot of the people in Portland have an opinion that he was on an up curve and an upswing, and he was in a good place at the point he took his own life, or that he was supposed to have taken his own life, and they're feeling that's why there's a lingering suspicion from those people that if he was going to, why then? And Rachel said to me, in everything that she's found out and in every study that's done, is that someone who is going to take their own life is more likely to do it when they're on an up curve than they are in a real pit of despair, because they have the mental facility and energy to do it then. And also because it's at that point that they're thinking that I'm not going back to where I've come from, which, you know, is an awful thing to have to take on board and contemplate. But I think in this case that's where I ended up, that everything I read and found out and the number of conversations, I do think that the greatest weight of all this is the worst possible outcome. It was somebody who just couldn't go on, didn't want to go on anymore. And
I think it's because the end for him was so. I mean, I'm not sure I agree with this, but I remember reading at the time. I mean, you know, 2004 is a bit before I get started in the music press, but I remember reading as a fan at the time that someone talking about almost that his death was almost like a statement, right? Because how do you do that? Like, that's not, like, I've never heard of anyone other than maybe in kind of Greek myths or what have you who took their life in that way. But you're right, there's a lot of supporting evidence, you know, like if this went to court, people would definitely think there was a road to that place.
Yeah, and I won't. The other, one of the other, Leah Quinlivan who's a professor at Manchester University, was another mental health professional I spoke to, and that was what I'd sent her a lot of material and said, could you read through this and just offer your opinion, because there is this doubt and all the rest of it. And she was very helpful. She just said that one of the things is she spent a lot of time studying suicides and suicide prevention, and she said one of the worst aspects of, and worst is terribly, but one of the heaviest aspects of that you have to deal with this is it's just eternally surprising what someone is capable of doing when they're in that place. And she did tell me a story that was a personal story to her. And again, like we said right at the start, when you're absorbing all this information, it's oppressive and it's dark and it's all the rest of it. But there is that sense that that you can't really contemplate what someone will do to themselves or is capable of doing unless you're in their shoes, and none of us were in his shoes.
Yeah, no, totally.
So,
yeah, did it challenge just as a person, did it challenge any of your preconceptions about mental health? Did you feel like you had a school in it?
No, and not no. I mean, I've you know, I've been aware, and I've known, I've been friends with people who've had mental health issues, but I think as much as it made me aware of my own ignorance and how easy it is even with goodwill to underestimate it, or to not be aware of signals and signs and things like that, and which is why, you know, when and the weight of it in all the people you know, because there were so many people who were friends of his who have this residual guilt that they feel that they feel like they should have been aware of what was going to happen. The people asking, what could I have done? The whole issue of it is it's such a massive subject, isn't it? Because it affects so many people in so many ways, both people suffering with mental health in whatever degrees it is, and then the people who are closest to them, in terms of their understanding of it and how they deal with it. So no, it made me, as much as anything, aware of how vast my lack of knowledge is on this thing, and now, you know, what a huge issue it is.
Yeah, that's really humbling to hear you say that, though. I think more people in our field who write about musicians could do with a bit more nous, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Was there anyone you wanted to speak to that you couldn't get to?
Yes, I mean, there were family members, and again, you know, it's difficult that they have a very particular view, and for obvious reasons, and didn't want to talk. Joanna, who, you know, was one of Elliott's partner, I couldn't get to, and Neil Gust, who was the close friend from university, played in Heat Miser with Elliott. Just didn't want to talk. So there were a few, probably 4, 5, 6 people that when you do the list of the people you want to speak to that were on the list, and I just couldn't get to. And then again, there were people in that way of doing things I didn't expect to be able to speak to who were willing to speak after a period of communication. So I think on balance, there were a lot of people that I spoke to, and there's always those that just, you respect the reasons, just didn't want to do it.
It is so meticulously researched, though. I do think that's really what sets the book apart. I love that thing when you're looking for sources and you get an email from someone that you really want, but you didn't think it was going to happen. I love those.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. I totally forgot, or maybe I wasn't even aware of just how funny Elliott was.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing as well, because he's almost this sort of patron saint of misery. There's bits where I was like, yeah, I bet he was really good to have a beer with. Was there anything that you kind of thought, oh, I didn't think he was like that, but the more time you spent, quote unquote, with him, you thought about him in a different way?
Yeah, there was lots of that, because I think that goes back to the question about mental health. You have to, your own preconceptions and stuff like that that two-dimensional view that someone who's suffering from mental health issues is forever woe begotten, and that's clearly not. He was a human being in all facets and shades and all the rest of it. And I found out so much that was delightful and did lift you. I loved the bit that finding out that he loved fun fairs. He would loved going on rides at fun fairs and things like that. And all those little details were just fabulous. I mean, there was a guy called Garrick Duckler who was Elliott's high school friend, and then wrote lyrics for him, or he used his lyrics right the way through to the end of his life. And he was one of the people. He said, "I will communicate with you by email. I don't want to hop on the phone, but I will email you." And you'd think that you're going to get a couple of lines here and there, but he sent me thousands and thousands of words. Sometimes I'll send just this screed of stuff that would go through about just impressions. He'd like the impressions of going into Elliott's bedroom and seeing his bookcase and things like that. And there was so much from that came out of it that, I wouldn't have been able to write the book without that, in the way I did, without that sort of insight. And Dorian, I mentioned Dorian Gary as well. This idea, she mentioned that his smile would light you up if you got him to smile, and the fact that I love the bit that she said one of his ambition. He had this thing about clowns and clown costumes, and he had this ambition to turn up on the Canadian border in a clown costume and suggest he was going to a clown convention. Just that notion. I mean, it sounds trite, but the idea that someone who had the issues that Elliott had, but he obviously had another interior life and exterior life as well, and you do that. That point, you think, he'd have been a good guy to have a beer with.
Now you finish writing about him. I mean, you're still talking about him, but now you finish writing about him. Do you miss him, or are you pleased to be free of him for a bit?
In the sense of having to, I'm pleased to be free of the weight of that, because there's a weight of, I mean, like, you mentioned Richard, there's a weight of responsibility I think you feel writing about people like that you do them justice, and you do their issues justice, and you do it with the balance that's required. So there's an easing of that responsibility, if it doesn't sound too pompous, but I'm delighted that I feel like almost more connected to his music than I was. And my son, my oldest son now, he's 18 years old, plays in a band, writes his own lyrics, and he, through the process of this, got massively into Elliott Smith, because I said to him, you read these lyrics. This is something. This is the way to write about what you've, and so we've sort of had that shared thing there that we talk about Elliott Smith, and we share Elliott Smith playlists, and he does Elliott Smith playlists and things like that. So I think that that musical attachment's probably going strong through doing the book.
Amazing. Well, it is one, like I say, I read so many music books, and it's one of my favourites that I've read so far this year. So
that means a lot. Thank you, James.
All the props. But I tell you what, though, I love your writing about football. When are you going to write about football again?
It's an interesting because I did. I did 2 books. I did the book about the 3 degrees, which had all the access in the world. But then I did a book about Euro '96, and just through not being a football journalist and having those, it was incredibly difficult to get hold of people. And it lacked because of that. So I guess it would just depend on if the right thing came. That 3 degrees book seems to have just got a life of its own. It sort of ticks on. I'd love to do something, but it would need to be something. There were a couple of things that came up afterwards where nearly happened and never quite. But I'd love to do it again. I like writing about football. It's if the right thing comes along, and I felt I didn't do the United 6 thing justice. I wasn't able to do it justice, and it would have to be done with that you could tell the story properly.
Yeah, it's weird. I did Brian McClare for the podcast.
Yeah,
and it was cool. He's like a big indie pop guy. He loves his C86 and stuff. And I think I'm going to do Pat Nevin. And when I did the Brian McClare episode, those people were like, "Oh, I'd love it if you did more footballers," and I was like, "So would I." But how do you even get to these people? And with the best will in the world, I mean, my team with Doncaster Rovers, it's quite niche. I don't know how many people are flocking for my James Coppinger interview. So, but I do love. I don't know. I just think it's. I think you said that obviously me not being a football writer, but I think that's what was so good about that 3 degrees book, that it was like. It was like with a different voice that I don't really find with people who just exclusively write about football. So I hope you do write more about it in the future.
Thank you. I'd love to. I would love to. Yeah.
Amazing. Okay. Do you know what you can do next? If it's not football, I mean, I don't want to know because that's not what you do, is it? But have you got an idea about what your next book is?
Yeah. I mean, the next one's pretty much there. There's an American offer there, which I'm going to accept to do it, and then I'm waiting this week to find there's the UK parent company just in terms of where it is. But so the next book's virtually there, and then I'll start work on it, and it is probably in terms of subject matter and mood, and entirely it is the extreme shift that you'd want after Elliott. So yeah, a bit of light relief, I think.
Amazing. Well, let's talk again when that's out.
I'd love to, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book as well, I have to say.
Yeah, let's talk more about that off when the recordings when we're not recording. But thanks so much for your time, Paul. I'll speak to you again.
Cheers a lot. Thanks a lot, James.
Cheers, bud. See you, mate.